Is that the schedule that you have? Can we make a copy of this? Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 2022 Junior Thesis Defense. Welcome. Thank you for joining us, parents, mentors, students, teachers, faculty, staff, panelists. Junior Defense is something that BCA does every single year. Juniors have, at the very beginning of the year, start thinking about a topic. That topic comes from a long line of a conversation. Adler wrote in the early 1900s that Western thought, starting from the Greeks, is a great conversation. This golden thread that is asking, we have foundational principles, but how shall we live? At BCA, we have the Bible as our foundational principle, but how shall we live? For example, the Bible says, bring all your goods to the church, and then it will be distributed evenly as needed. Does that mean we should live communist? Or should we have a different style? Interesting conversation. And that is one of the many things that we have as debates here at BCA. This year, though, on the students' own volition, chose them, what comes out to them. And they, through their research, understanding the long years of the great conversation, are going to end that conversation. After researching it, they have decided to come forward with subjects that they will weigh in on, such as law, politics, literature's influence on society, education system, all based on what they've discovered in their research on the medieval age. So let's get these topics started. Mr. Brandon.
All right. Juniors, are you guys ready to do this? It's ready to be done. All right. We didn't want to make any big last minute changes, but your presentation, instead of being 7 minutes, will be an hour now. So just a quick heads up on that. All right, we're excited for you guys to be done. You're almost there. 7-minute presentation. And this is going to look a little different than the senior projects, as you may know. There's not a visual component. This is going to be based primarily on you being able to summarize your research and your arguments. So much of the junior thesis is your ability to express yourself through the art of rhetoric, using persuasion, logos, pathos, and ethos. So we're excited to hear your arguments. The panelists here are content experts, and they're going to be able to push back on some points. We like to refer to that as putting weight on the bridge. So imagine that you're the bridge, and we want to keep putting more and more weight until it snaps. right? No, they're not. We don't want your bridge to snap. We want it to hold strong. And so just as architecture has principles to support, we want to see, can you support those arguments? And we're looking forward to hearing your thoughts. Again, 7 minutes for your presentation and then 7 minutes for the panelists. For the first panelist, in a moment, we'll hear from Elizabeth Blencoe on the immortal King Arthur. We will have 3 panelists, Mr. Darren Schmidt, Mr. Josh Snell, and myself. The reason we have 3 on the first one is because, number one, it's such an epic topic that all 3 of us really wanted to do it. But also, that's actually just the only main reason. For the first one, we just wanted to have some of us teachers start us off. Without much further ado, we're going to start in just a moment. In fact, this is perfect timing to get a little extra time to Elizabeth Blencoe. Would you come up, please? Elizabeth Blencoe, the immortal King Arthur. Do you feel comfortable using the microphone? Awesome.
Hello, my name is Elizabeth Blencoe, and my junior defense is on Arthurian Legends' impact on medieval European society. Before I start, I'd like to thank my panelists and my audience for their time. Everyone here has heard the name King Arthur. If you close your eyes and try to picture him, who do you imagine? Is he strong or is he weak? What does he wear? Is his sword Excalibur with him? Many of you probably just thought of a tall, strong man dressed in knight's armor with a long sword and a bright crown upon his head. This is the Arthur of medieval England. But why did you think of this version of him? It is the version we know today through movies and modern retellings we read. And throughout the ages, King Arthur Pendragon has been the inspiration for many people, both king and common man alike. His story has survived in one form or another for over 1,000 years, and his image has changed from a Roman warlord to a brave young king to the Holy Roman Emperor himself. Most modern people think of the medieval English Arthur because of the popularity and influence he held over the Britons from 1000 to 1500 AD. His story encouraged chivalry and courtly love in a world where ruthlessness and brutality were the quickest means to survival. He became the medieval equivalent of Superman and was a common name on the tongues of peasants and kings. Arthurian legend had an enormous impact on medieval European society through the effects of popular literature on people's mindsets, the growth of courtly love and chivalry, and the favoring of a unifying figure and the admiration of a hero who is worth imitation. Heroes are the culmination of what humanity admires, and by reading and writing about heroes who are high-minded and strive for good, people begin to imitate them. The dictionary definition of a hero is someone who is admired for their virtues and noble achievements. Throughout history, heroes have followed a very specific behavioral pattern called the hero's journey, where a hero is shown some flaw in their world or called supernaturally. They venture into the unknown, whether it be the underworld like Aeneas or the bottom of the ocean like Gilgamesh. They are victorious, and they return to their own world to overcome the evil that began their sojourn in the first place. King Arthur follows this hero's journey, his calling, the sword and the stone. His unknown is his mortal wound and death in Avalon, and his return will be in the future, where he is rumored to return and save Britain in its greatest time of need. For the hero to submit himself to the pain and hardships of this adventure, he has to sacrifice his own time and health and have certain characteristics, such as selflessness, strength of mind and will, and courage. These are the characteristics that unite all heroes. King Arthur is a hero who conquers and fights enough to be called a great man, but is loving and kind enough to be called a good one. Heroes, what they stand for and what they embody matter because of what it tells us about society and the warning it gives. If heroes are written as what a society looks up to, but it's only natural to assume it is also what they will imitate. Whatever we read and write is extremely influential to us and proves that literature is a powerful tool that can shape both our individual minds and society itself. Plato says, poets and storytellers are in error in matters of the greatest human importance. They have said that unjust men are often happy and that just men are wretched, that wrongdoing pays if you can avoid being found out, and that justice is what is good for someone else, but what is to your own disadvantage. We must forbid them to say this sort of thing and require their poems and stories to have quite the opposite moral. King Arthur is proven to be influential to medieval European society because of how many historical examples we have of people trying to tie themselves to him. Many kings from England and Normandy especially claim to be his descendants to say they had the right to rule the Anglo-Saxons. King Henry II had a coat of arms with Brutus, King of Troy, and first King of Britain, and King Arthur. Both Edward I and Edward III of England claimed to be latter-day Arthurs to say they had the right to rule Scotland. Ellen of Aquitaine set up the court of love in Poitiers, where she commissioned Arthurian romances and poetry and glorified chivalry and courtly love. It is obvious that Arthur and his legend had a big impact on medieval society simply because of how many people knew of him and what his name brought to mind. That is power and the right to rule. Finally, the reason the Arthurian legend had such a big impact on medieval society is the fact that Arthur was an archetypal hero. He had risen above common folklore and become someone that people put their hope in. He sits with the classical heroes and is even one of the 9 worthies. These were men who were extraordinary models of chivalry and heroism. For context, they were Joshua, King David, Judas Maccabeus, Hector of Troy, Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, King Arthur, Charlemagne, and Godfrey of Bouillon. Arthur combines qualities from different great men and is almost an average of them all. A conqueror like Julius Caesar and a great king like David, Arthur's defining characteristics are bravery, selflessness, and selflessness. Arthur is idealization of heroism because he imitates the divine in his love for his people, his giving up of himself to them, and even his ruined return to save them. He is an awe-inspiring figure who combines the warrior king of epic poems and the philosopher king of Plato. Arthurian legend has had an enormous impact on medieval European society through the growth of courtly love and chivalry, having a unifying figure to admire, and countless historical examples of people using him as an authority. He shows how people can idealize and imitate what they read about, and shows that if we model ourselves after heroes who are both great and good, we can improve ourselves for the better. Because of how influential he was in the Middle Ages, as well as in modern day, Arthur's story will continue to inspire generations after us. The inscription that was engraved upon Arthur's tomb, according to Sir Thomas Mallory in The Morte Arthur. Hic iacet Arturis rex quantum recte futuris. Here lies Arthur, the once and future king.
All right. I had a quick question. So first off, like seriously, I truly, really loved your paper. I really did. It was awesome. Very, very high quality, very high caliber. I don't know. You know. Keep going. There were a few questions I had though. One of them, and I guess just to kind of jump into it with this, was at the end near the end of your paper, you said that Arthur, truthfully, has been reframed in different periods of time. Just to begin by maybe making an immediate practical connection with this audience, how would you envision giving our current context in world history? What would the American Arthur of today need to look like in order to capture what we need and the ideal hero that we need right now culturally?
I would say that if we had an Arthur today, he would have to be a strong warrior because Arthur has always been, no matter how he's changed, he's always had warrior-like qualities, and he's always been a strong leader. So I would say a strong leader who is willing to be bold enough to protect his country and not willing to give in to anything.
Awesome, thank you. I have a bunch of questions I want to share with the other panelists too, but one real quick before I hand the mic off. When you talked about in the 12th century, there was sort of almost a renaissance of Arthur, and there were many new developments in his story. Was the 12th century when Merlin first made an appearance, or do you know when he made his first appearance and how that shifted the dynamics of Arthur's cycles of stories?
Yeah, so Merlin first made his appearance in, he first became popular in Geoffrey Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain, which was, I think, the 11th century. And it definitely shifted because Arthur went from, he was very kind of obscure folklore to Merlin made him the king he was almost. He was an advisor, and it went from more of like a folklore to a mystical, more powerful king.
Interesting. Okay.
You talked about how Arthur, how his representation has changed over time. Is there a particular period that you favor more over the other as far as the image of Arthur? Maybe something was either gained in a certain period or was taken out later?
I would say Probably the Arthur from the Lord Arthur, but Thomas Mallory, which was in the 1400s, because he definitely becomes more chivalric and he becomes this great warrior king instead of like overly romantic or overly brutal almost in the beginning. Popular, like he's who we think of today, but I think he's probably that's probably the best version of him, I'd say.
Elizabeth, this is such a wonderful survey. Reading this felt truly informative. I've loved Arthur since I was a kid, and yet reading this filled in a lot of blanks. And so, well done on the research and the summaries. One of the big tension points that I've seen here, and that I know in your research you encountered, was the chivalry, that between the conquering hero and then the courtly love. And that tension doesn't always seem to be clearly reconciled, meaning even with Arthur, he doesn't seem to always have the courtly love aspect of chivalry. In fact, Lancelot shows that in lieu of Arthur, perhaps. So my question is, I feel like Eleanor of Aquitaine kind of hijacked chivalry and made it all about loving on the queen, because she commissioned poets, perhaps, to do that. Do you think that Arthur was actually chivalrous in that sense, or do you think that he failed to be chivalrous according to Eleanor of Aquitaine's rendition of that?
I would say that Arthur failed Eleanor's version of chivalry just because that was a very romantic, pining after your lady type of chivalry. And Arthur shows he fights for what is just and he loves his people, but he definitely shows less love towards Guinevere, especially after he figures out what's going on between her and Lancelot. And even though he ends up forgiving her, it's not a romantic type of love anymore. It's more of a honor because she's a queen.
Okay. And so, yeah, again, just even from your paper, it does seem like the French, through Eleanor and others, shifted the focus. And you wrote that from Arthur to his knights, especially Lancelot gets to be a larger-than-life hero who's French, in the book, Lancelot de Lac. Do you think that if that was done intentionally to shift it away from the glory of England to glorify France more?
Definitely, yes. The French, I mean, part of it was they had ladies commissioning a lot of these books versus in England where it was written for more male audience, I guess. A lot of knights aspired to be like Arthur's court, and a lot of kings aspired to be like Arthur's court. Was in France, it was ladies commissioning poetry and romances because they wanted material relief.
Okay. And so with the first definition then of the conquering hero, and that's why with the worthies you have Alexander and Caesar, who I like how you make a distinction, maybe not good, but they're definitely great. So how do you see Arthur being, characterizing that chivalry, being this larger-than-life conquering hero? Because you mentioned his sword in the stone, and then his death. Are those the main ways, or is there something else in his life that showed him to be this worthy hero?
I would say instead of looking at individual events in Arthur's life, I'd look at it as a whole. He gives up everything he has, all his time and all his health for his people. And so, yeah, he conquers a lot. He becomes a Holy Roman Emperor at one point. But instead of looking at specific events, I'd say it was the fact that he gave up his whole life for his people instead of being selfish like some kings and being weak.
I'm in that conundrum where I have so many questions I want to ask. I don't have time to ask them all. So one I want to kind of, I think this will tie in a few things. You talked about how he imitates the divine, is the philosopher, more of a philosopher, keen like Plato. So that there's this kind of like what I'm saying, there's this conquering aspect, but he's way more multidimensional. And he's not necessarily the hero of everyone all the time. There's some ways he exemplifies one more than the other, even throughout periods of time. So one question I had about Eleanor as well was, given Eleanor of Aquitaine, this year, historical context within the Crusades, and the way that was shifting medieval thought of just war theory and all these things, how do you think maybe even the Crusade and that context of Europe through the lens and the channel of Eleanor of Aquitaine, how did that is there a perceptive shift between Arthur before and after Eleanor in which maybe that historical context played a significant role? What do you think about that?
I would say it's interesting that the romantic Arthur was kind of born at the beginning of this bloody war. But I think there was a reason for it, and it's because people were looking for something other than, growing up fighting all day, you don't want to come home after a few years just to more fighting. And so I think the romantic Arthur was born because of that, and let me see your question.
Yeah, how do you, given the historical context of the Crusades and how that was changing Europe's idea of just war, and the fact that Eleanor of Aquitaine even went on a crusade and then later returned and wrote these after her experience, do you know if there's any perceptive way that maybe those experiences of the Crusades affected her idea of the ideal hero and courtly, because you talk about the introduction of courtly love and sort of, is there a shift between the conqueror to the courtly love around Eleanor that maybe her historical context would play into?
Yeah, I would say it's mostly the birth of like chivalry because of I know the First Crusade is definitely more justified than others, or a lot of people say that, but I think people say if you introduce a chivalric Arthur, then it's more of, well, we want justice, we don't want just random bloodshed.
Awesome, thank you.
A lot of time there.
Quick now.
I'll try to be quick now.
You talked about one of the things that happened in the 15th, 16th century time is that there was a decline in the importance of the Arthurian legends in England, but that it came back in the 19th century. What permitted that change to make it more relevant again?
Partially because people were beginning to explore like history and trying to write historical fiction and stuff, and there were definitely chivalry was a big part of the 1800s, and so I think if you have that, I don't think chivalry ever died out, even if King Arthur's Legend did. The effects of it didn't. And so as people remained chivalrous, they began to explore probably what began it in literature that involved it, and so that's probably why Arthur made a comeback.
Awesome, well done. Excellent, well done, Elizabeth. I'm sure there's more questions that some of the audience may have on King Arthur. So many more, I'll confine you and ask you later. Thank you, panelists, Mr. Schnell, Mr. Schmidt. In 5 minutes, we'll have Morgan James present on Charlemagne's education at 10:30 sharp. So please be back in about 4 minutes. Thank you.
of classical education that Charlemagne taught, and American schools need to bring that back in every school. Back in the Middle Ages, Charlemagne helped introduce a new age of education to his people so they would become more successful in life. He built schools for major professions such as palace schools for the royal court and their family, monastery schools for future clergy, and episcopal schools for everyone else. Every school focused on the 7 liberal arts to cover all aspects of learning. Charlemagne encouraged the writing and copying of manuscripts to develop reading and learning, the alphabet. Students learned the alphabet by studying the Book of Psalms, and this guided the pupils to later learn more about God and become closer to him. Charlemagne implemented the 7 liberal arts into the schools so that students could understand every aspect of life. America later rejected the 7 liberal arts to focus on arithmetic, science, and history. The 7 liberal arts that are not in use today are rhetoric and logic. These are one of the most important parts of the arts because they make the brain work more by analyzing and the information which is given and understand it better. Modern schools focus on the rapid advancement of a student instead of helping them follow their passion or potential. When Charlemagne founded the schools, he invented master and apprentice relationships. These relationships benefited the students because they can learn all they can from someone who is an expert in that study. The student gains more of a personalized education, not like a tutor, but an experience to take over what the master is knowledgeable in. A quote from Bruce F. Rosen, who wrote Philosophic Systems and Education, says, "The student must bring himself closer to the absolute through imitation of the exemplar, the teacher. The teacher serves as a living ideal or model for the student and represents, to some degree, what the student can become." This one-on-one learning helps the student get the most out of their education. This is unlike modern universities or colleges in America. Their system prefers to have a mass amount of students come through their halls without giving them proper guidance or attention. When universities were first formed, they were modeled after Charlemagne's education by incorporating the master and apprentice relationships. Charlemagne brought brilliant minds from Italy, Ireland, and England to help build up a better education system. This helped branch out their knowledge and make it accessible to everyone, all the while using Christian themes as a defining factor in those schools. He brought a man named Alcuin into his home to have himself and his family educated, to set an example for his people. Alcuin was a Latin poet, educator, and the greatest scholar of the era. A quote from Britannica says, "Alcuin introduced the methods of English learning into the Frankish schools, systematized the curriculum, raised the standards of scholarship, and encouraged the study of liberal arts for the better understanding of spiritual doctrine." One of the topmost scholars of the era highly encouraged the study of liberal arts so that there was a better understanding of spiritual doctrine. If Alcuin were alive today, he would be disappointed that America has not only abandoned one of his most promoted studies, the 7 liberal arts, but also does not focus on the spiritual doctrine at all. According to one of our own teachers here, Tanya Lavelle, who has a master's in curriculum and instruction development, says, "Part of the Enlightenment was this kind of idea that man has self-sufficiency, that he is enough in himself. So we lost that connection of education being connected to God and your faith." Faith in America has decreased over the years since classical education was removed from schools. And now there's less of a connection between God and the students in those schools. Today in America, education is more of an expectation than an experience. The expectation in America is that the parent must send their child to school at a young age, whether it be public, private, or homeschooled, and have them go up through high school. The student is then expected to either enter a college or university, but the student must have grades that are acceptable to even be considered, graduate high school, receive the proper education, and have a lot of money, which not everyone has. American education, in a sense, is a privilege to afford, but is promoted as mandatory from a young age to go to a college or university as soon as possible. But that is not necessarily true. The expectation now is that you get free education, but not necessarily knowledge. He, Charlemagne, had the expectation of knowledge. Now the expectation is just that you will complete K through 12, as said by Tanya Lavelle. America has fallen into the trap that the social standard and expectation is to go to college or university without the consideration of personal expectations. It can be argued that the reason America has strayed away from the 7 liberal arts and incorporated more math and science studies is that there are more careers now that involve arithmetic and science, a lot more than during Charlemagne's reign. Today in America, America is a more technology-based society, while Charlemagne's more manual labor, with the less need for more math or science. Technology may be the way to go for a while, but if society will rely on technology and not our God-given intellect, we'll start to become illiterate as time goes on. If schools were to bring back classical education, but also incorporated more math and science, then everyone will receive a better, well-rounded education. So what? Why does this matter? Why is comparing these two different ways of education important? The reason is to show why America's education does not live up to the high standards of classical education, such as Charlemagne's. Charlemagne's way can open up the mind up to new ways of thinking about education. The 7 liberal arts is a first-rate education system. It teaches one to have proper grammar, think logically in any situation, make stronger speeches, write persuasively, and it works the whole brain to make it healthier and stronger. The best chance for students to gain a well-deserving education and grow up into well-functioning members of society is through the 7 liberal arts in the form of classical education. America's education system has strayed away from the concepts of classical education that Charlemagne taught and needs to bring it back in every school. Throughout it all, there has been a drastic change in education with the loss of a well-rounded education system for everyone. Thank you.
Good job. I'm gonna not use a mic, I'm just gonna talk loud. That's okay. So I have lots of questions. I'm trying to figure out which one is the best one. Okay, so you mentioned that the purpose of current education is for mass production, and I was wondering what you felt like the purpose of education way back in the day was compared to that.
Compared to now, or?
Yeah, compared to now, production-wise.
Production-wise, there was more of a need for more knowledge because not everyone was able to receive knowledge. So they wanted just everyone to become educated. Now it was just you flow through it and you don't really get knowledge as much.
For sure. Do you think that as society develops, technology-wise, population-wise, whatever, do you think that education should develop with us, or do you think that we should remain focused on more classical, maybe ancient-ish skills?
I believe that, yes, society will move on, and so will education will keep up. But it's also it's good to go back to your roots and have more art instead of being on the computer 24/7 and stuff like that.
Hi, good job.
Right, thank you.
I was wondering if you could identify some barriers or obstacles that would have to be addressed in order to implement the type of educational system that you're describing at a national scale.
Oh, I did not really cover that as much, but it would be hard to implement now because education has been the same for years. So it'd be hard to switch from this public school way of learning to what our school teaches now because there's a drastic difference. So it'd be hard for students to change to that. So I'm not sure how it'd become a change because I didn't really focus on that much.
Thanks.
So I think one of the main things that you're trying to make is that holistic learning is peak. Yes, would you agree?
Could you repeat
Holistic, looking at things through a very spiritual lens, how everything interacts with each other in itself.
that? Kind of, but not quite.
Okay. Okay. Well, I was going to ask if it were to be more holistic, which maybe is not the point that you're making, but if everything was supposed to interact with each other, why is math and science not quite in your definition of learning, even though it is in the 7 liberal arts, like astronomy, geometry, and arithmetic, or math and science things that seem to be like you're pushing back on a lot?
Could you rephrase that?
Yes. You mentioned that the 7 liberal arts are very important for education during Charlemagne's reign. And you also mentioned that math and science should not be the most important ones, even though they are included in the 7 liberal arts. So I would like to know your argument on that.
I'm not saying that math and science is not important. It's just not as incorporated. But when I get towards the end of my paper, I would suggest that classical education should be like those 7, but also include the math and science just as equally, not like having one above the other.
For sure. Do you think that we can take grammar, logic, rhetoric, all those, and incorporate them into math and science, or vice versa? And how?
I'm not sure about that. I didn't really focus on that much.
I have kind of a personal question for you. So what do you believe is the purpose of higher education? You discussed kind of like personal interest versus like attaining gainful employment with the math and science. You discussed the importance of that for employment. And then how does that influence the direction that you see yourself going in education?
So what is your question in that?
So what do you believe is the purpose of higher education?
Higher education is just gaining, like, consuming really well-rounded knowledge that you can put forward to either like teaching others or into future education for other people or yourself, and like hand that down to other people. But also like not know everything because you're not perfect, but just gain a lot of knowledge so you know a lot, basically.
And what direction do you see yourself going?
I would just like to learn more because I came from a homeschool background, so like it's harder for me to keep up in like classroom settings. So I don't know as much, but like once I finish high school, I'd like to know as much as my peers.
You also discuss some of the issues with going to university and kind of like not knowing which direction you want to go. You make a statement, and I'm sorry, I only have the end of it written here, but receiving no help from their peers. And this follows a statement where you're also previously discussing mentorship at the university level. And I was wondering if you had kind of envisioned what a good mentorship or what a framework for a good mentorship program would look like at university level, where you have, you know, such a higher student to teacher ratio. And if you had thought at all about the value of peer mentorship versus instructor mentorship.
I would also agree with that because I would just prefer, like, not prefer, but like have the idea that there would be more like help along the way instead of just being pushed in there and just, being on your own. But like peers would also help. So what exactly is your question again?
Yeah, in your discussion about mentorship, I was wondering if you had thought about the value of peer mentorship versus instructor mentorship.
I think it would work well to also have peers along with mentors because they're not on the same level, but they're close. So still having some influence on a direction to go with your education would help from peers or mentors. So both would be good.
Okay.
All right, great job, Morgan. Thank you for that. Thank you, panelists. Appreciate the discussion on, so what? What do we do with the education? We become live streamers to 10 million people in Russia. All right, we're going to take a break, and we'll be coming back in about 15 minutes, right before 11 o'clock. So please go get some refreshments, stretch your legs, get some fresh air, and we'll see you for David Schmitz in about 15 minutes.
Oh, so good.
And I have to start protesting. Don't let them say this.
Folks, up next, we have Mr. David Schmidt presenting on modernity complicates inheritance so much through the growth of overall population and advancement of technological law, with panelists Seth Bivney and Jason Steiner. Let's give it up for David Schmidt. I do request that you use a microphone for panelists and for presenters. Thank you.
Hello, my name is David Schmidt, and I would just like to thank my panelists and my audience for being here. So, according to Oxford Dictionary, inheritance is to receive money, property, or a title from the previous holder at their time of death. So that can be anything from like houses to a company to just plain old money. And this barely scratches the surface of it. Nowadays, it's taken care of by official law, and not recently, in like the late ancient times, that's when it was decided to be taken care of by official law. You know, in like Egypt, they would be buried with their valuables, and the rest would just go to the family. So the big question is, how does modernity affect inheritance, and how can we use past experience to help us improve the current process? And the short answer is, although technology and growing knowledge should make the process easier, instead makes it a lot more complicated. So why? So what? What's the big deal? Why do I have to talk about this? Well, inheritance will always be important, especially in America, with finite money. Like, you know, we don't just make money all the time. It's always like the value is always rising. And then if we didn't take care of it and it was just left gathered dust in the bank, it would weren't seen as equal as men, which kind of sucks. Another thing is like overwhelming. Growing up by itself is hard. It always will be like super stressful because you are the future. This stress has negative effects on the body, including anxiety, aggression, physical illness, and often substance abuse, which, when it comes to heirs, that explains why so many trust fund kids have substance abuse issues. Being an heir makes this a lot more stressful, as you can probably imagine. In the future, you're going to have millions and millions of people counting on you, and you're learning the alphabet. It gets really stressful. I think that heirs should also have like a special way of being raised. There's all kinds of skills that need to be developed, including like problem solving, reasoning, and attention span. All of these things are not fully developed until you're around 25. A lot of the time, heirs would be on their own. They would be official kings by the time they're 16. They wouldn't have advisors anymore. That's 9 years before their brains are fully developed. I think they should have to learn the significance of people. You know, you look at 1 million, you're like, wow, that's a big number. It's 1 million people. It's all these people counting on you, and it's up to you to figure out what's going to be their future. So one last point is that I think, or second last point, is that clarity should a lack of clarity. I think it should just like void the will to avoid a lot of conflict. So there's a movie, Knives Out, from 2019, and in it, a very rich man who dies or suicides, that's the murder mystery of the movie, he leaves all his money to a nurse, their nurse that took care of him for the last bit of his life. And the family is furious about this. They're bringing up all kinds of points, like he was on morphine and he was manipulated, all kinds of stuff to just try and avoid it. Now, this could possibly be based off of a real case that happened from 2011 to around 2016. And it was the painter and actress Buette Clark. In, I think, May 2011, she passed away with a $300 million estate and left it like the second largest chunk to her nurse and her goddaughter. She spent her last 20 years in a hospital living out the rest of her days. And that's why she grew so close to her nurse and her goddaughter. 19 relatives ended up suing the people that got the money because they were saying that they manipulated her. These 19 relatives never really visited her for the last 20 years that she spent in the hospital. I understand that they're distant relatives, but the nurse ended up feeling so pressured that she ended up getting back $34.5 million worth of gifts and stuff. And the relatives just walked away with it. And I think that's kind of messed up, you know? They're just there for the money. They don't really have a relationship with her. So I think that if they're left out of the will altogether, they shouldn't just be able to sue. They were specifically excluded. And one last thing is that everything is connected, not in a holistic butterfly, but like we're on Earth in 2022 and we have internet. We have all eyes on the royal family, all celebrities' children. And that makes everything a lot more stressful. Literally from birth, we're looking at the heirs of the royal family in England. And again, that makes it just a lot more stressful. So I think that we should probably change this and make it so that it's a lot less, they have a lot more privacy, they have a lot more specialized education, and they're just raised like people. So that's it. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Jason. You answered my first question right at the end. Thank you about privacy and just raising people like people. And so thanks for touching on that point. Another thought I had was you mentioned in your paper like greed wins again. And with that case, do you have any thoughts or recommendations to avoid that evil influence or that greed influence in the modern system?
Well, a lot of times, I hate that this happens, but lawyers are doing it to get paid sometimes, or most of the time. I'm sorry. That's, you know, the more expensive lawyers are better at their job. And so they'll do, and the judge for this case, actually, in the Buette Clark case, actually ended up saying after the nurse gave back $34.5 million worth of gifts and everything that she gained in the will. I think that it shouldn't be like that. They were 19 relatives, probably more, were specifically excluded from the will because they weren't really relatives. They were related, but they weren't like family. They weren't like friends. They weren't really there for her. their last 20 years that she spent in the hospital. And so I think that they should just be able to I think that they should just take it as it is. It's their fault, really, to me, that they didn't get anything because they were just so distant and so selfish about it. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. Makes me, reminds me of just taking somebody at their word in their will, rather than trying to change it afterwards, so. Another one I had, you mentioned about not accepting a will. Should we accept a will, somebody's last wishes, even if they're not perfect? Would it be better than having none at all? And having a more enthusiastic thoughts avoid it and what?
Well, if it's void, go back to the primogeniture example where a lot of it goes to the firstborn. This is in the case that a spouse is not present. If somebody dies with a spouse, everything goes to the spouse, and then they figure it out from there. But when they were, I lost my train of thought. Can you restate the question?
Just if there wasn't a will, then what?
Then, yeah, it would probably just go back to the primogeniture where firstborn gets everything if the spouse is not present, and then, I don't know, maybe then it would be necessary to have legal action. But you should always make sure that you look at the wishes of the person who passed away. Because you have to respect the dead.
David, you did a great job. I really appreciated the coverage of themes that we don't cover in law school. The emphasis on the pressure on error is not something that crosses most of our minds, and so to think about it in terms of what an heir might be going through, the pressure that an heir has to retain a fortune, and the responsibility he has to an estate. If he's very young, he's not fully developed. I thought that was piece out in law school. So I really appreciated how you've wrestled the topic in really in an innovative way, I think. I wanted to go back to that the firstborn heir solution. Are you a firstborn? Are you not the oldest?
I'm the youngest.
Well, good for you. No, that is a self-sacrifice. So, but I do would like to hear you wrestle with that a little bit, with the pressure on the firstborn to inherit if there isn't a will. The idea is that they're protecting the whole estate, and that all of their siblings, in an older time, it was really the responsibility of the oldest male to take care of his mom and his sisters. So how do you wrestle with the stress that would put on your firstborn sibling if that were the rule today?
Well, there's already pressure on firstborn when it comes to protecting their siblings, teaching their siblings, being the oldest, and I don't know, if you go to the same school as them, you're protecting them from bullies and stuff. There's already pressure there. And so you're getting a lot more pressure when we go back to the primogeniture, where they're the firstborn, so they should get the majority, if not all of it. I think that's really putting them to the test to determine their skills. Like, it's the big test to figure out how well they have been an older sibling. Now, if they're truly selfish, then tough luck.
Just one last thought from me. Myself, I looked into a living trust because I had heard, there's all these legal battles, watch these movies like you mentioned. I'm like, oh gosh, how can we avoid that? So Had you ever looked into like modern legal remedies to not have that legal battle, for instance, a living trust? Any thoughts about that?
I think that, well, okay, in this duet, there were 54 different like things that throughout 3 different countries. It's massive. I lost myself. Can you restate the question?
I was just wondering if you had looked into modern remedies, like things like a living trust. I don't know that case specifically. Maybe they have a trust, but I think it would be harder to fight in court against someone when the property is already transferred. But when there's a question, like somebody dies, like if there's a question of who gets it, then I can see where there's a legal battle. But if there's not a I'm just curious if you looked into any resolutions to that in your research.
I was looking more into like the big kings and stuff, but here,
It's fine if not, just curious.
yeah, I
No
don't
pressure
really
on
have
it.
that much of an answer for this.
No, that's fine. Okay, that's it for us. Thank you.
Great job, David.
Appreciate it.
David, do you know if grades are inherited through inheritance law? You pass on your grades. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, David Schmidt. Well done on that. We're going to take a quick break, and in about 4 minutes, can we come back, please, for Anna Bever's current government compared to ancient and medieval government. Thank you. come back
Just
together.
waiting for my personal message.
Our next panelist will be Mr. Jason Ford and Mr. Andre Julio. Our presenter is Anna Bevers on current government compared to ancient and medieval government. Thank you, Anna.
Hi, my name is Anna Beavers, and today I'll be talking about medieval government, and I will be comparing it to current government. First, I'd like to thank my panelists for being here and my audience. The Founding Fathers wanted a constitutional republic based off of an ideal shaped by Greek and Roman political and philosophical thought. America has deviated from those ideals, which has led to a socialistic tyranny. In America's government, there is a share of power, a check and balance system set up so that they would keep each other accountable. They would not have a radical direct democracy where the people's wishes and the people's desires get in the way of what is best for the country and the people themselves. The Founding Fathers knew all too well that too much power for a government official was bad. America was not a democratic society, nor was it a direct democracy. It was a constitutional representative democracy ruled by laws that were few and limited, with elected officials who made the wishes on behalf of the people. Both the ancients and the Founding Fathers strove for the same ideal government. The Founding Fathers wanted a type of government whose powers were few and limited, convinced that the biggest threat to their freedom was not with their people, but their own government. They strove for this government because they wanted to find a golden mean, or why is America not a promising idea? It is not a promising idea because in a constitutional republic, or back in ancient Rome, the aristocracy, there are leaders to represent the people instead of having the people's wishes get in the way of what is best. Plato was one of the few philosophers who believed that we could fall into corruption with a single leader. There were three forms of government at the time: monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. Over time, these would decay and become something a government should not be. Polybius explains that each government goes through what is known as the cycle of life, or the life cycle. We start with the growth stage. Now, think of it as a baby, just learning to grow and do things with the help of others. The second, perfection. We think of everything as it should be, the Garden of Eden, or think of it as a teenager, growing, becoming more responsible and mature, with the help of others, learning how to become adults. The last one is the cycle of decay. Now, the cycle of decay is something that can be found in the government or in political officials. It is a government that has been corrupt or failing because the officials or the people in office have corrupted themselves with bribery and let themselves just take over what is best for the country, and they want to take all that power for themselves and not even include the people in the government activities or what is happening in our daily government or what is actually best for the country. They are allowing themselves to take over the power. They have racked up $300 trillion in debt, and this is a current issue because if this continues, we are going to land back in a Great Depression, which we are already going back to. Now, the Great Depression, one of the most prominent things is that people did not have the money to care for themselves. Gas prices are going up currently. There are food shortages, and we are being limited on what we can buy and cannot buy. That is why the Great Depression happened and why it's coming back. And it's not the best decision for the government itself. How did America's government become corrupt and why? America's government is corrupt because of the way that the government officials have completely disregarded the Constitution that the Founding Fathers put together, and the way they are not letting the people become a part of the government activities and what is happening. Three societies, America, Britain, and France, spent a century implementing political reforms to protect their political systems. A ballot or mixed government was the cure. If we choose to let our government take over what is best for us, we'll have a tyrannical government, which is to say an oppressive leader with only his interest at heart, not the government or the people. If we want that, then we can continue with our way of life, living in fear with no perception of what is true or what reality actually is. Then we can live like that because that is what we are most familiar with. But we cannot choose to stay silent and let our government take over and ruin what our founding fathers worked and poured their life into. This government means a lot. Our founding fathers poured their blood, sweat, and tears into this country. They did not want our government to become like a tyranny. If we really wanted one single ruler, we could just go back to Britain. Like, if that's what we wanted, just go back to Britain. Who cares? But our founding fathers didn't want that. They wanted something that the people could be a part of. They wanted something that everyone could take part in. They did not want for our government to fall into the hands of a tyrannical ruler. They did not want huge debts racked up to $300 trillion. They did not want food shortages and the Great Depression. They did not want this to happen to our government. So what? Why should this matter to any of you? It should matter if you care about America and your future generations that plan to live here. This matter is exceedingly difficult for most people to understand. We believe that if we do not stand up and do what is right for our country, we will allow it to fall into the wrong hands and destroy all that we have worked for, all that the founding fathers have worked for, and all the ancient philosophers believed. We need a new foundation to start this country on. Because if we are going to continue the way we are living, our future generations are going to have to handle the debt and the food shortages. It will affect us lifelong if we do not fix the mistakes that our government has caused and ourselves. If we would just look around and see the mess that we have created and that our government has created, it would be a much better life for all of us. Because we can fix it if we actually see the problem that has been caused or started. We need to do something to protect our country from the evil that lies within our own government. Our country would become just like Rome, a great empire, a great country, but in addition to becoming great, we would be known for our economic crisis, our corruption. Do we really want others who come here, our future generations that live here, to remember our economic crisis, or do we want them to remember the land of the free and the home of the brave? America's government needs some work, and we can fix it by reverting back to what our government had originated from. Thank you.
Pushing the button.
Here we go.
Well, thanks. That was very passionate. It was passionate when we read it. It was passionate when you spoke. I appreciate that. It was fun. I'll also thank you for teaching me a new word. I don't know how to say it. Ochlocracy.
Ochlocracy, yeah.
Watching TV the last few years and traveling the country, I needed a word to describe mob rule.
Yeah.
That's my question is, what can we do about it practically? I struggle with this myself, right? Towards the end, the conclusion was we should stand up, and that's a good verb. I struggle with my family and my kids to do something about, the crazy that we see every day. Can you talk about what standing up means in a good way? Because we don't want to become ochlocrats.
Mm-hmm.
That's a word.
Yeah.
We don't want to become a mob ourselves to overthrow the mob. But what do you kind of flesh that out a little bit of something practical that we could do to stand up against the tyranny?
Personally, what I think we could do is we could take matters back into our own hands, but in a peaceful way. Because in my paper, I believe I mentioned that we can stand up, but our government is taking away the rights that we have currently. like if we look at the First Amendment, it says we have the right to peace. We have the right to assemble in our own homes, the freedom of speech, press, and such. And if we look in 2020, we were not allowed to do that. And so people started rising up, such as they would go and protest at the Capitol. But those protests were not all that peaceful. If we look at Minneapolis, what happened to that? They burned down the entire city. And what would be best to stand up is if we try to peacefully talk about our problems instead of going on a riot or burning down cities or killing people. We need to talk about it with someone who would understand, such as if we talked about it with someone in our own Senate. I've done that recently, and they said that one of the best things we can do is to just continue standing up in our own ways. But I didn't really cover a whole bunch of that area, but we can stand up in a peaceful way instead of going into riots, such as going to the Capitol. We just need to peacefully talk about our problems without causing bigger ones.
That's great, thank you. A follow-up, the cycle that you mentioned.
Yes.
It feels like we're sort of on the backside of the cycle, right?
Yeah.
It's obvious. In the Middle Ages and in history, is there anything that people did to slow the fall of our cycle, right? We got a couple hundred years in. It's kind of the cycle of a good aristocracy or democracy. You get a couple hundred good years, and then do you see any practical examples of cultures in the past that did something that could sort of mollify or slow that down to preserve it?
No. A lot of what I researched based off of like Athens and Greece and Rome, they didn't do anything positive. Such as if you look at Julius Caesar, what happened? He refused the crown 3 times, but then peer pressure finally got to him, and so he took the crown. And then he started like slowly treading into deep waters by taking power and not really letting people have say. And so the Senate, his most trusted advisors, went and killed him because they're like, yeah, no, we don't want to deal with this. But a lot of the countries that I've seen, they haven't done anything positive to implement into their own government. And I don't know personally what we can do to implement it into our own government because I can't, like, they don't listen to us.
All right, lovely. Once again, I have to second your passion and the delivery of the speech is excellent. And you've already expressed personally reaching out to communicate with representatives, which I think is excellent. But you also mentioned that it seems that often there isn't listening that happens. So if the solution is to talk about it, what do you do when those who wish to discuss choose not to listen?
That I do not personally know. But out of my own experience, you have to find someone that you know will listen, someone that you can trust, someone that you can peacefully talk about it with, such as whenever I'm at home and I wish to talk about something that's really bugging me. I have to take a while because I'm very passionate about a whole bunch of things. And so you really have to you have to calm yourself before you speak out. Otherwise, you could speak out and regret some things that you've said. But if they do not wish to listen, then that's their own problem. They're just going to cause more problems in our country.
And then for you personally, what do you plan to take away from this research and project here?
I plan on, whenever I graduate, I plan on becoming a lawyer or a politician. And so I plan on personally implementing some reforms into my own personal life. Or a politician, I can implement those reforms into the country in a way that's positive and beneficial for everyone and not just for my own self.
Lovely. And that's where you talked about, for example, bribery and corruption often becoming the downfall of a particular nation as politicians. So for you then, what is your personal strategy? Like, have you given any thought to how you're going to keep your head above the mire heading in that direction?
I haven't really thought about that a whole bunch because right now my main focus is focus on what I have currently before I move on into the future. And so if I want to like move ahead into the future without finishing what I have here, I can't multitask very well, and so that's going to become a problem.
Fair enough. Awesome. Thank you, Anna.
Bravo. Our 10 million streamers are going to vote for you, they said, so you'll be getting the office shortly. Thank you, panelists, and thank you, Anna, for that. In a few minutes, we'll have Josie Knowles present on Truth Prevails, Christianity in the Viking Age. So please be back in just about 3 or 4 minutes, please. Thank you. All right, folks. Up next, we have Josie Knowles on Truth Prevails, Christianity as the True End of the Medieval Viking Age. Panelists Josh Snell, Kelly Holtman, and Jason Ford. Let's give it up for Josie Knowles.
everyone. My name is Josie Knowles, and before I begin today, I would like to offer a sincere thank you to my panelists and my audience for being here and listening to me today. For my junior thesis, I will be arguing that it was ultimately the involvement of Christianity that ended the Viking Age. History books have it wrong, or at least the ones I've read do, so let's start with what's true. The Viking Age began in the late 700s and it ended in the 11th century. This was the time in which seafaring Germanic Norsemen originating from medieval Scandinavia violently raided and pillaged through Europe on a large scale. These Norse tribes were called the Vikings, as the word Viking originates from the Old Norse word Vikingur, which translates directly to pirate or raider. So when I use the title Viking, I'm not referring to a physical race, but rather a specific mindset and lifestyle that specific Norsemen possessed. The Vikings originated from medieval Scandinavia, as I said, so they practiced Norse paganism, which was the religion celebrated by the medieval Scandinavians. The rest of medieval Europe at the time was primarily Catholic Christian. Despite medieval Europe's immense military, plus the combined forces of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, as well as constant plotting and never-ending strategizing of attacks, the vicious raids and mass slaughtering delivered by the Vikings just seemed to never stop. For ages, these Norsemen exhausted the powers of Europe, and for ages, Europe failed to escape their grasp. However, there was one thing that truly stunted these raids and ultimately caused the existence of these violent warriors to come to its end. Without the involvement of Christianity, the Age of Vikings and their violent, unlawful raids across Europe would not have ended in the efficient way that it did, and they likely would have prevailed long after. Europe's monarchs decided to attempt to convert the Vikings to Christianity as a last resort to peace in hopes of stopping the attacks. They offered political ties, alliances, land or wealth, and more in exchange. And often, after being baptized, Viking chiefs would either return to Scandinavia as Christians or rule over Christian settlements. With the help of the Viking tribes being converted by European monarchs during their travels, plus the active Christianization of Scandinavia, as well as any political pressure put on Vikings to convert, the terrible Viking raids finally stopped. And Christianity was the root to each of these events that collectively caused the Vikings to abandon their endeavors. In the year 878, King Alfred the Great proved victorious in the Battle of Edington after he conquered the Danish Viking chief Guthrum and his entire Viking army. After conquering Guthrum, Alfred had only one term in regards to the Viking surrender. If Guthrum was to be spared and attain safe passage out of Wessex, he had to accept the Christian God as his own and be baptized in a church. Guthrum, who at this point was willing to accept any other fate besides his death, readily agreed, and he was baptized in a church. He received a Christian name and left Wessex. He eventually became the King of East Anglia. He maintained a friendship and alliance with Alfred until he died, never once returning to his former Viking ways. The conversion to Christianity specifically demands the abandonment of sinful ways, which is why the existence of Vikings, violent pirates and raiders, dwindled after the fact. In publicly claiming or promising their new loyalty to the Christian God, a Viking basically had to stop being a Viking. Another example of this is when King Charles of France converted the Viking chieftain Rollo to Christianity in the year 911. But I'm a little short on time today, so I can't delve into that in this speech, but it had almost the same effect, if not an even better effect. The sincerity of the Vikings' religious conversions was likely questioned at times. However, the Vikings were commonly offered these desirable commodities in exchange for political or religious ties, so accepting and conforming to the terms of public religious conversion wasn't necessarily ever really regarded as a big issue for most medieval Norsemen. Whether or not the promises of submission to the Christian God were genuine at heart in all cases, the requirement that they forego their violent ways was still met almost every time, at least in order to acquire what was offered to them. While Viking tribes were being converted to Christianity during their travels and raids around Europe, a massive religious conversion was also simultaneously making its way through Scandinavia. This is another one of the many ways that shows the end of the Vikings was centered around Christianity. With Christianity spreading through Scandinavia, the homeland of every Viking, the need to maintain this violent lifestyle became less and less important to them. By the time all of Scandinavia had adopted the Christian religion, any remaining Viking people no longer adhered to Norse paganism. Olaf Tryggvason, Viking chieftain from Norway, led a Viking pursuit of England in the year 991. However, monarchs, as I said earlier, were now regularly establishing ties and alliances of some sort with Viking chieftains through religious conversion. So Olaf returned to Norway after being baptized himself. When he returned, he was seen as the king of Norway, and he began to introduce Christianity to the country. For the most part, his people accepted it with no issue, and Norway was completely converted to Christianity by the year 1000. Before his reign, though, political power throughout all of Scandinavia was not concretely established. And once Norway adopted Christianity, Sweden and Denmark soon followed, and then Scandinavia's politics just slowly began to centralize around these three kingdoms. And by the mid-11th century, Scandinavia was almost entirely unified through Christianity. The entirety of the Viking homeland, adapting to the new Christian beliefs, helped inspire the remaining Viking tribes of the medieval age to convert themselves as well. Along with Christianity trending in Scandinavia and Viking chiefs now establishing ties with monarchs, there were also a bunch of practical reasons that inspired the Vikings to make this conversion. Firstly, at this time, Christian traders would not affiliate with non-Christian traders, and Vikings were given access to the Christian trade routes if they were baptized. Another aspect is that Vikings lived side by side with Christians without conflict for decades, whether or not it was in Scandinavia as it was being Christianized or in Europe as they were settling. And the Vikings were known to be highly adaptable people. So as they settled in areas of Europe that were already Christian, they usually swiftly began to conform to the lifestyle of the locals. There was also a bit of political and societal pressure put on the Vikings to convert. Basically, just their homeland was becoming unified through the Christian beliefs, and Viking chiefs were now becoming Christian nobles, and Christian commoners remained in the good graces of Christian superiors. Each of these different practical aspects helped in a different way to push the Vikings in the direction of a life without unlawful pillaging and bloodshed. Although it is said by some that Christianity was only a part of the cause that put the Viking Age to rest, there's evidence points to the fact that Christianity was just involved in almost every aspect. It is important to acknowledge the reason that the Viking Age truly ended, because this was an incredibly devastating and hopeless time for most of medieval Europe. For centuries, they could not escape the Vikings. The idea that the concept of Christianity was finally the only thing that began to unravel these Norse warriors' thread of power over Europe should not be overlooked. And if Christian values were able to dismantle the Viking Age over time, perhaps the same values deserve to be considered elsewhere. The Vikings terrorized most of Europe for a very long time, and when it seemed as if all hope was lost, they were properly introduced to Christianity. It was almost entirely this conversion of religions that put the final stop to this age of plunder. Within every overlying and underlying cause that ended the Viking Age, the inspiration can almost always be traced to Christianity. Christianity is its true end. Thank you.
Super good job. Like, this paper was awesome. And same problem I had earlier. I have way too many questions to fit in. So I'm just going to start with a couple real quick. One thing you talked about, and I want to follow this through a little bit, is you mentioned in your paper that Harold, and I love your argument, Harold Hardrada was actually not the last Viking invader, because he was actually a Christian noble who was settling a political dispute. So what would you say was, if it's not Harold Hardrada, what was sort of the last Viking invasion?
So my intention when I first started this, assigned paper was I wanted to write about that in general initially. But I found that it's not concrete anywhere throughout my research. It's kind of, no one can pinpoint the exact end. And I believe that people sort of took to that idea that Harold Hardrada was the last, his invasion of England was the last Viking raid, and that day in 1066 was the official end of the Viking raid. I think people have taken to that because it gives them a specific date, and it allowed them to forego even more uncertainty. But there is no distinct one, at least that we have today. A lot of evidence was lost too.
Awesome, thank you very much. One kind of, instead of going through, I'll jump one question I thought of when you were talking. I thought would be interesting is, you mentioned that sometimes people question the legitimacy of some of their conversions. Could you maybe just kind of talk about or reflect how you think the issue of Danegeld maybe reflects legitimacy of some conversions, and if you agree that with Danegeld, one of the common understandings was you could pay the Vikings an exorbitant amount of money. They're going to come back next. They don't care. They have no honor regarding this. They are kind of pirates in that sense. But once they convert to Christianity, is it true that at that point they're like, yeah, this gold's enough for the rest of my life. I'm fine. I'm not attacking anymore. Could you maybe talk into that a little?
In my opinion, yeah, next, but I was thinking of getting more into kind of put that aside for my paper specifically. So I didn't do too much research into the bingo. Can you rephrase your question?
Yeah,
and
do you,
kind of summarized manner?
Yeah, so, well, they were given land, for example, and well, okay, maybe they just converted because they got land. But I was thinking maybe feeding into that, they were given land and money before they converted to Christianity, and it seemed to mean nothing to them. Is it true that once they did convert, they were like, yeah, now we're satisfied. We don't have, like you said, we don't have to be Vikinger anymore.
Right, I do believe that, yeah, that's generally what they thought, because that is what, even though it had been done in the past, that is what ultimately brought the Viking Age to an end, because that's what made them stop. So yeah, I agree with that.
Awesome, thank you. I'm gonna.
I would like to take just a minute to congratulate you. That was articulate and fluidly explained. I'm curious about one of your definitions of terms. I want to talk about Christianity. You seem to be that these people converted to Christianity, which in my mind means that they were committed to following Jesus with their whole lives. And yet, the tone of your paper makes it sound more like a philosophical morality that they were submitting to. Can you talk about that?
What do you mean by philosophical morality?
A list of behavioral changes. They're going to behave themselves and not steal from their neighbors.
So kind of regarding like the sincerity of following Christ. In most cases that I found, like Alfred the Great conquering Guthrum and King Charles conquering Rollo, evidence points to the fact that it was sincere, that they had every desire to truly follow Christ after that. But, hold on, my thoughts are escaping me. Okay, can you repeat your question one more time? I kind of just lost my train of thought.
Well, I think that you've done a pretty good job of answering that and saying that, yes, it was an authentic conversion. So I'm going to take you in a different direction just a little bit. This was a forced conversion for the purpose of changing the behavior of this people. And it seems to have been effective. Ought we to employ this and maybe force to convert? Would this have the same sort of positive effect today? Should we enforce conversion? And why or why not?
Well, I wouldn't entirely say that the conversion that I wrote about specifically was forced, because it was their last resort, and so they offered all of these sorts of things in exchange for, the religious conversion. But they did so that there would be like a mutual understanding between them, and in the hopes that it would inspire some sort of like kinship and friendship between them, which in most cases it did work. But I would not say that the forcing of conversion would be as successful today, especially now that Christianity is, so much more developed, I would say. I want to be careful with this, but like all these like hundreds of different denominations and everything did not really exist at this time. They were like Catholic Christian as it was, first beginning to spread.
Thank you very much. Sir?
We just heard about the cycle and the fall of civilizations. It's just kind of flipped because the Vikings were the ones that fell and Christianity succeeded. But bring it to like a current day question: if our society is the one that's being influenced by pagans now, pagan influences on a Christian America, is there any takeaways we can get from how the Vikings fell to Christianity and how America's I'm trying to flesh out that reversal, but help me out with the question. Give me a takeaway. Give me something that you can compare from sort of the reversal. Christianity helped the Vikings, and now the Vikings are sort of killing us. The pagans are taking Christianity away from America. You get any insights into that reversal?
I'm kind of careful with my answer here, but I've considered this myself, and this is one of the reasons I titled my paper "The Truth Prevails," because it's my personal belief that Christianity is the truth of life, basically, and that through every situation it has been the thing to prevail. So regarding regarding the Vikings, it prevailed over the paganism. And I would just take away to remember that. Does that answer your question, Matt?
Yeah.
Okay.
Let me give you a practical question. 0 to 100. You started with history has it wrong, or my history books do. That's a bold statement. I agree. 0 to 100. How much of our history our documented history books is wrong?
Regarding the Vikings specifically?
Yeah, in this paper, how much of what you came across did you read that and go, that's bogus? 100%, 100 is it's all false. 0 is all true. Give me a number in between.
It's kind of hard. I would say 50-50. So it's right and wrong because, kind of 50% of the source books that I read for this paper was, they were kind of two halves. So it was more of the philosophy and moral side, and then there was the kind of concrete information, words, which is what has survived and what we do have. But it was more of like the morality and philosophy side, in my opinion, that was wrong because they were saying that, like, Harald Hardrada was his pursuit of England was the last Viking raid, and then it ended on this day. But he wasn't a Viking, So I would say that 50% of these books was wrong in general.
I came late to the party, but I enjoyed it. I'm going to read your paper after the fact, but thank you very much.
Excellent. Well done. Shows out in our students and prove at least 50% of the story is wrong. Well done, Joseph. Very powerful. Just a reminder that the students chose these topics completely on their own. We opened it wide up, and so we're very proud of the topics you chose and the diligence you've shown in studying these. We're going to take a 10-minute break. And then we'll have one more student present before our big lunch break. And Mr. Tiven Litzer will speak on fixing public education. So please be back at 12:10. Thank you.
Okay, we'll get started in just a minute. So,
I'll call you up. All right, folks. Last presentation before break will be on education, and the one after the lunch break will also be on education. And it's just, again, wonderful to see that students choosing this of their own free will got to choose these topics and whatever they wanted, and they chose education, something near and dear to their hearts. And so we're looking forward to hearing the ideas and solutions. And just as a preface, part of, we asked what's the so what of these theses, we are taking this into account. I know, Tiffany, you're going to make an appeal to how we can improve education, and our 10 million viewers, I think, can take this to their schools, wherever they may be. So without any further ado, on the improvement of modern education, Tiffany, let's see.
Hi. I'd like to start off by thanking my panelists. This was a bit last minute, especially Mr. Brendan. He really helped with this. And thanking my audience here, sitting here today. You can see some of my family just sitting in the here. And there's Austin. It's great. And then all my fellow students who helped me through this. And then our 10 million, 20 million? What are we at right now? Viewers online. I'm going to start off with a quote. If I have seen further, then I am standing on the shoulders of giants. Isaac Newton. I'm going to stand on the shoulders of one of the giants of the school. His name is Austin Diven. Now, Austin, on his presentation, he talked a little bit about how madness harnessed for good can create good effects in the world. But I'm going to be talking to you about a different kind of madness. Imagine this, because we've all been there. You're sitting there at your desk, running off of 3 hours of sleep, so much coffee that you're going to be crying tears. Your tears will be black for the next week, and you got to finish your homework. Reading an entire book, Don Quixote, about this thick, writing a paper on it to prove that you know it, and then memorizing various different other things like how the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. On top of this, you just spent 7 whole hours dealing with teachers droning on, and it's nothing against you guys, but teachers droning on about their subjects and annoying teenagers and young adults because they are annoying. This is the average day of a student, and this is actually a good day. You see, schools these days are not built well to educate. There are many different problems. The ones that I'll be addressing are type of teaching, the length of classes, and homework, because that kind of is a controversial subject. Now, when I say type of teaching, there are 2 types of teaching that I'm talking about. One is passive learning, and the other is active learning. Passive learning is, as I said, when teachers drone on and on and on about a subject, and you sit there and write notes. Active learning is where you actively get engaged in the subject, and this makes it so that, 1, it takes more time, and 2, you actually learn stuff. There was a study done, and it was shown that active learning versus passive learning, people in passive learning groups felt like they learned more and actually knew less. And people in active learning groups felt like they learned less, but they knew more. This explains why active learning wasn't instilled in classes, because good teachers who want to instill stuff like this will ask their students if they feel like they're doing good. And if they're like, no, this isn't good, right? I'm not learning anything here, then they're going to switch it up to where they feel like they're learning. This makes sense. Another thing is, for active learning to be instilled, there is not a good enough class time for that to work properly. So what we do is we double the class time. This is not saying turn a 7-hour day into a 14-hour day. That would be a bad idea. What we do is we look at the neurology. How do we learn? There's something called working memory. What this is the thing that makes it so when you go short term to long term, has to go through working memory. This can only focus on a few subjects at a time. If you're only subjects at a time, then you can learn the thing. But if you get a bunch of stuff thrown at you, the first things that were thrown at you, you can learn. But the things after that, you lose. This explains why when you're in school, you're like, oh, I know everything from the first 2 classes. The second 2 classes, I'm kind of iffy. There were a 6th class at school today, right? It's inefficient. Another thing for what making it so that you have half the classes is it makes it so that there's half the class's worth of homework. This doesn't mean that you do, a little bit of homework. There are some studies for how long homework should be, and it basically averages out to, if you're in a 6-class system, you only get 15 to 20 minutes of work per thing. Now, there's some other stuff in my paper that I've addressed about homework, but what cutting the classes in half would do is allows you to get more engaged and get more engaging homework. This will help in the long term. So what? Right? I'm just like, what am I going to do about it? I'm a high school student who wrote an 11-page paper twice. And, what am I going to do? I thought on this for quite a while. And I can't do much. But what I can do is I can ask you. If you're a student who genuinely cares about the future that you're going into, please tell your parents. If you're a parent who cares about your child and the system you're putting them into and about their future so that they can learn, please tell the school board. And if you're a school board, if you're on the school board and you think, that would be a whole lot of work, you could be part of the largest change that has ever happened in public school for decades. Public school has not changed in a very long time. And when it worked, it worked. But as we've been going through, I think it's evident that we have 3 students, myself included, saying what is wrong with the public education system. It needs to change. Thank you.
Thank you, Tiffin. Excellent delivery. As your rhetoric teacher, good job. Do you remember?
I learned from the best.
Do you remember how you hit your speech limit? I'm going to get practical here. You hit the time. Do you remember last year when we did this?
Went like 5
minutes. No, it was supposed to be 5 minutes and we went over 20 minutes.
Oh.
So there's something inherent in the system that we do here that has conformed you to a system that hit 7 minutes?
It's the kill.
It's the kill. It's the kill. It's getting cold. Should you talk about enforcing a system through the bottom-down effect? So students talk to parents, parents talk to the board installs change. Why not go a top-down effect? Go to the national government and force public schools to do changes across the board instead of a grassroots method from the very bottom of the students.
I've thought of that, right? And that is something I've genuinely pondered. This is something I pondered for a while when Austin brought up the subject when I was working with him on it. The problem with that system, right, or me going to the top and then working down, if it worked, it would work, right? But like I said, I'm just a high school student, right? If I'm going to a bunch of people, right, who feel like they know what they're doing, because they do feel like they know what they're doing, or else they wouldn't be doing it, then they're just going to be like, you're a high school student, you know? What say do you have in this? But I know that there are students here that genuinely care about their education. And I've seen students who don't care about their education whatsoever, and I feel bad for them. But the students who really care can go to their parents. And if the student can convince the parents, and they can usually do that, right? And if they don't have the rhetoric skills, I have a paper that I can send that to the whole school. And then the parents can go to the board, because the board are likely to listen to parents rather than myself. Because who would you listen to? You know, some teenager who wears a skirt in front of a whole crowd of people, or the parents who are funding the schools to make sure that you actually have the money to keep going.
So in your paper, you talked about getting rid of homework altogether, or at least changing it in a certain way. What would like a change to homework to make it more, as you put it, like active instead of passive and stuff, or more engaging? How would that change look to you?
That's a hard one. For me, it would, the way I would solve the problem, because the problem is basically, you got a bunch of things that feel like a bunch of busy work that you do for points, right? That is basically what homework boils down to right now. What I would do is I would get a bunch of teachers and a bunch of adults and say, if you were to learn these subjects, and if you were to do homework on this, what would you want that to look like? And then take the collective knowledge of that and work through that. Because I do not have enough knowledge to implement changes such as homework, because homework is very content-based, right? And I don't have the content information to work with that.
Right. Yep.
Yeah. Well, one of the I'm gonna reverse this. Like one of the questions you asked, I think I have the answers for, because you asked, do I even have a 6-hour class? And you deal with my history class. Part of what I'm very fascinated by too in your paper and your speech is the conviction that you have. You're very moved by this, and it's very moving to see. And also the development of your argumentation. So to go right into one of the big points, you mentioned first 2 periods people can learn, third and fourth maybe, fifth and sixth, not so much. My concern with some of the arguments is how possibly subjective they could be based upon one student's experience, that being yours. You do have great citations of some other teachers, so there's definitely some principles that make sense. But for example, to say that at the end of the day, that it is, just as paraphrase, extremely difficult to retain any knowledge about. My experience with teaching at the end of the day for the last few years is that most of the students, the vast majority, seem to retain very well. And so when we have these sweeping statements, I guess my concern is that, do you feel it's based on a subjective experience for you? And if so, is this possibly saying perhaps it needs to be individual shifts rather than everybody needs to shift this for all education?
Good question. I'm going to ask one real quick to clarify something. But when you say your students, are you talking about the students here, or your students as in the students here and your college students?
I've had the opportunity to teach at many places over the years, and I've not seen it become significantly less at the end of the day. After lunch on full bellies, I've actually noticed stuff there. So, but I wouldn't say at the end of the day that's to be written off. I think it's still outstanding performance even at the end of the day. So just again to restate that, do you think that this could be an individual solution for you, or is this something that you do think applies to all students?
So I think the answer to that would be that you as a teacher are causing that individuality, because I've been in your classes. You're way more of an active teacher. You're way more of a performer of you perform these teachings, right? Rather than sitting there and telling people what to do, you go and you like express it, right? And I feel like that would cause a lot of people to retain more of that information. And some of it just depends on the students. Others depend on the content, and I would agree that content would help. But overall, I think it would be beneficial to do the 3-class system, because it's not losing content, right? You still have the same amount of class time through the whole thing, and you can even teach it better because you have more time to teach it, right? So it doesn't lose class time. But is it a subjective experience? I don't think it's an entirely subjective experience. I would say that there is a good amount of objectivity to it, where classes later in the day is harder to focus in. But because I've noticed that through other schools that I've gone through like 4 different schools in my time. But no, I didn't get kicked out. We were moving. But it would be inevitably, I wouldn't know.
Okay, just one follow-up. I know our time is a little short, but could you briefly just explain your experience then with this thesis project? What type of education was this for you? Was it passive or active? And what are the big takeaways for you in this experience?
Big takeaways for me. It's a hard one. One of the biggest takeaways for me is to ask for help, right? That is the way that I got through this after working and working and working. Asking for help is probably the biggest takeaway I've gotten. And as a learning experience, I would say it was phenomenal as a learning experience. But it was absolutely terrible to go through from a personal standpoint, because it was just like piece after piece after piece, and I didn't feel entirely ready after stuff started to break down, right? Passive versus active. I would say that when it was actually a bit of both, because there was some passive learning in there where you and Abra were explaining how stuff would be working, right? But then there was also active experience where you'd have us come up and you'd have us present so that we would be able to, be prepared for this situation. So I would say it's more of a nuanced answer than just was it passive or was it active.
I have one more follow-up. Going back to what you just touched on, active versus passive learning, do you think after shifting to more active learning, there's still a place for passive learning? Because like, if you're going through a book or something, like, I don't know how an active version of reading a book would be. Or like, you go to the 2-hour class system, you say, yeah. If you go to that and you're doing like literature class or something, how would you stay actively engaged for 2 hours without like some passive learning in there? Because like, I know for me, if I were like in a class super active for 2 hours, I'd start to get like tired versus like being fed information and being able to like passively take notes. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. I think that what we'd have to do is we'd have to synthesize the neurology work where you have to take breaks to be able to continue to learn stuff. And also the active learning. So with passive learning, if it's like with literature class, if you're wanting to actively teach that, it would be like, we're going to be performing this section, right? So we're going to learn this section as well as start to perform it. So we'll go through bit by bit by bit and work with that. So it would have to be more of an on-off system. It did say that with a purely active, some of the research that I went through, it did say that with a purely active system, it was better results overall, but it really performed well in like science studies, right? Where like physics, chemistry, stuff like that. So I would say that I would not get rid of the passive learning altogether. That seems like a drastic move, and that's basically saying that it has no use, right? Which I don't believe that would be the case.
Okay. Thank you.
Well done, Tim. I'll see you sixth grade.
Wait, were you sixth period? Hold on.
Well done. We really appreciate you putting your heart into that one, Tivin. And audience for being such good news here and listening. We're going to take a 45-minute lunch break. We'll be back at 1:15 for Sonia on education. Thank you. Everyone could please be seated. We're excited to conclude today with 2 more student presentations. Up next, with panelists Joel Fesserly and Danielle Diarra, we have student Sonia Forbes on how to improve the American education system.
Hello, my name is Sonia Forbes, and I will be presenting today on the education system in modern America. Before I begin, I would like to thank my panelists and my audience for being here, and all of your hearts and longing for a better education system as well. Because if you weren't, you would be in public school right now. America has commercialized their education system. Schools are often underfunded, and many students graduate clueless and unprepared for their adult lives. Classrooms are overcrowded, and it is next to impossible for teachers to engage with students' individual needs or institute interactive learning. The boxes the education system is putting students in makes it hard for them to thrive in their God-given gifts, and students with learning disabilities often have to rely on IEPs or individualized education programs to make it through school. If education is the foundation for society, America should stop commercializing it. Classrooms are overcrowded, and there are not enough teachers for the number of students per class. The average class size in America right now is 30 to 40 students per teacher. Although the main focus of my paper is how we are teaching and not what we are teaching, because that would be a whole separate thesis, I cannot avoid talking about rhetoric. Rhetoric is how to think instead of what to think, how to communicate thoughts and have discernment about others' arguments. Rhetoric is the art, practice, and study of all communication, and to understand communication is to understand how to learn. Like half of the book of Proverbs says, listening is how you gain wisdom and understanding. But the education system is not teaching students how to learn and then sticking them in a classroom of 30 to 40 students where their only outlets of learning are passive listening in classes for 6 hours every day, or independently studying through take-home reading material. There is no space for interactive learning. And of course, they can prepare presentations and write papers and ask questions to teachers, but that is not the same value as interactive discussions. People's brains work differently than each other's, and if a student struggles to learn differently than how their teacher's brain works, there is value in letting students discuss material with each other to understand it better and go deeper with it, especially when students have ADHD or dyslexia. Students with ADHD cannot focus on or interact with lectures as well as neurotypical kids, and dyslexics cannot take anything away from take-home reading material. This points to a lack of inclusivity for students with learning disabilities, and although the government has IEPs in place for students with disabilities, they would not be as much of a necessity if the education system wasn't so structured like you're a check on an attendance sheet or a grade in a book. And if you make it far enough, you might even get your name on a piece of paper that says that you finished. But a good education is more important than a diploma. I have also, oh wait, sorry, I already said that. I've also emphasized that independent learning is bad because you don't get the value of other people's perspectives on material, but I would like to just briefly address that COVID-19 makes all of the issues in the education system like 10 times worse. Not only because it further emphasizes passive listening to lectures and discourages small groups of people that could be an outlet for discussion, but also because deaf students who rely on lip reading cannot understand what people are saying when they're wearing a mask. A solution to help individualize education would be to reinstitute mentorships. However, these are heavily discouraged with COVID-19 regulations, and so is studying abroad. Mentorships are valuable, and if you have a base level education and a passion for anything, you could explore different fields of potential career paths and gain experience in them without spending thousands of dollars on college before you actually know what you want to do with your life yet. Specialization is vital to successful education. So why is the education so heavily commercialized? Students from the medieval era were equipped with more interactive learning and experience, and at the time, they would teach the 7 liberal arts. They were the foundation of education in the Middle Ages, and the goal of them was to teach and raise wise and virtuous leaders and wise and virtuous people. Liberal means something that sets you free, and art is a mode of making something. So a liberal art is a way of making a free people. It is important to note that the 7 liberal arts are known as prerequisites. They must be taught before students can learn anything else. even to children. They are grammar, rhetoric, logic, music, geometry, arithmetic, and astronomy. In the Middle Ages, students had them as an educational foundation, and when they were almost old enough for their own career, they would work with a mentor catering to a specific interest to prepare them for their lives. However, today in the American education system, students are not allowed specialization in their education until college, with the exception of extracurricular activities. A quote I found from the New York Times illustrates how some students are feeling about these issues. At this point, it's not even grades I'm worried about. It feels like once we've graduated high school, we'll be sent out into the world clueless and unprepared. I know many college students who have no idea what they're doing, as though they've left home to become an adult, but don't actually know how to be one. America can practically apply changes by putting more money into funding school resources and teacher salaries, not only so class sizes can be reduced, but also to improve the quality of education students are receiving. It will help encourage interactive learning and discussions about material in class, as well as making class more welcoming and inclusive for students with disabilities, with or without IEPs. Stop discouraging studying abroad and mentorships because of COVID-19. Stop making students rely on homework and independent learning without an outlet to process material with other people. Stop watering down deep philosophical concepts by reinstituting the study of the 7 liberal arts and de-emphasize grades. They are not an accurate representation of students' effort or intelligence. And finally, support students in their God-given gifts through fighting the commercialization in the education system.
First of all, good job. I have a clarifying question. I was wondering if you could tell me, you're using the word specialization. And can you clarify what you mean by that term within this context?
Well, I believe that everybody is created with their own individual sets of gifts, and with strengths there are weaknesses. And so specialization would be like more supportive for individual people.
As far as grading, so in your paper you talk about de-emphasizing grading. And I'm wondering, do you think that there is some value in grading to students, to universities, to the teachers, and perhaps maybe discuss what the balance between de-emphasizing grading versus looking into better ways to assess student progress?
Well, if we had mentorships, then they would probably know the students better, and so they could like better evaluate where they are with material in class, and also making oral exams and less like paper tests, making oral exams like more available would make it easier to like understand where students are actually at with material. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So looking into better ways to assess student learning. Yeah. Also, you discuss a lot of the benefits of interactive learning, and I was wondering if either in your research for this paper or just in your experience in general, if you have a particular method of interactive learning or something that you have found that is really enjoyable.
Yeah, totally. Just like interactive discussions where you can get people's perspectives in and like go deeper with material. I know Austin and Tiven often bring classes to like super deep points about things that I would never have thought about, and I think it's really valuable to have community when it comes to education.
So thank you, Sonia. That was really good. I enjoyed reading your paper, and I enjoyed your presentation even more. I know we're supposed to poke some holes in this, but it's hard because I agree with a lot of your points.
That's crazy. I was talking about this with my parents, and I said you were going to say the same thing.
You knew. You already knew. It's nice to know. So you mentioned Proverbs, and in Proverbs, God teaches us that wisdom is the principal thing. So when you're talking about education, are we talking about getting wisdom or information?
Oh, that's a hard question. Because wisdom like is more of a biblical thing, and that would be like arguing church versus state when it comes to education. Like it's under the umbrella of the government, and there should be more morality in schools, but I'm not sure what that would look like if you were like indoctrinating all of the students.
Okay, so if wisdom more as a concept of you can have knowledge and be a fool, or you can be changed and mature through the knowledge, that would be gaining wisdom.
So that's more not so much on the religious bent, but what is the goal? We're talking about education reform, different ways to do it. But if the goal of education is a free people or a virtuous people versus commercialization, so I'm trying to push in like, what's the goal of the reform?
Okay, so in the Middle Ages, the goal was to raise wise and virtuous people. But you can't really have that in the education system if you're not allowed to teach students about truth. Because right now in society, people are like, it's my truth or your truth. You're not allowed to talk about or objective reality anymore because that's like politically incorrect.
So then there needs to be a standard?
Yeah.
By what standard?
Well, I would say the Bible, but that's why we teach rhetoric, because then you can like talk about what propaganda is and how to avoid that while also talking about divinity.
So in your paper and presentation, you talked about getting a good education versus getting a diploma. Isn't the diploma proof of a good education?
If the grading system is accurate, then yes.
Okay, push back on me a little bit.
Well, right now we have like bubble tests where you can just like fill in all of your answers, and there's like I've heard a couple ways of like cheating on that. I've never done that because but I know a lot of people who have. And so if it's multiple choice, then you're not actually like talking about what you've learned and going deeper with it. You're just responding to information that you've memorized.
Okay. Well, actually, no, it brings me back. The last comment I made was really good. So you said that you haven't been in public school, so you haven't had maybe the opportunity to cheat in those ways.
Yeah.
Is that because your mom knows if you're cheating or not?
No.
No, okay, so that was a joke, but really, it really does point to and I'm just gonna highlight, I don't know if this is so much a pushback as it is, when you are in homeschool or in a smaller school, you have that level of accountability, which I think really is that mentorship, closeness that provides better grading and better way of seeing where students are at.
Yeah, that's a
Good job.
word.
Good
Thank
job.
you.
Excellent. Well done, Sonia. We actually have just an extra minute or two. If you'd be willing to take a question from the audience, Sonia? Would you be willing to take a question from the audience?
What?
So audience, this is open up to you if you have a question for her about the presentation.
Hey, what's up?
Question. So, did you mention increased government funding for teachers to create smaller classrooms? How would you get economic stability with that? Where does that money come from?
Oh, that's a good question. It's also the one I was like most afraid of. I have some information on that in my paper, but I've never taken economics and I'm not really good with it. So I don't have a good like articulate answer to that.
But we're doing economics next year, so.
Yeah. David?
So you touched up a bit on mental disabilities, right? Do you think that everyone should be taught the same way in every classroom scenario?
No.
Or should there be a separation of certain people?
Okay, so I was talking about IEPs and how like students with disabilities need IEPs when they're in the education system because it's so like structured. So I think that all students have strengths and weaknesses and that it doesn't have to be a defined label in order for students to need a individualized education. Crystal?
I have a question. Do you think that changing or the grading system would make a lot of students lose motivation? Like, specifically students who like thrive off of academic gratification?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I feel like a lot of those students have really strict parents, and so that's also a good motivation. But I'm not actually sure. because that's about the heart of the individual person, and I don't really want to like group everybody together. Rachel?
What do you think about grouping people based off of their age and grades? Do you think that should be differently based off strength, weakness, and specialization, or should grades be kept together?
Well, that's why people advance. Like if a grade is like too advanced for somebody or too like hard for somebody, then they'll get held back or like advance ahead. So I don't really think that it.
The question is more about they have to be a master on all fields in order to move grade ahead.
Yeah.
Do you think that makes sense, or do you think it should be classes based off of, like, you can have a 10th grade math and an 8th grade English?
Yeah, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think that's a good thing.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Sonia. Good follow-up. Love putting you on the spot. Well done. All right, in a few minutes, in about 5 minutes, we'll have our last presentation of the day from Lola Schultz. So at 1:35, our next and last presentation.